Our speaker tonight is Dr. Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross founded Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to demonstrating the compatibility of science and the Christian faith. As an astrophysicist and pastor, Ross has spoken at hundreds of universities, conferences, and labs around the world. He's written numerous books, including Rescuing Inerrancy, Navigating Genesis, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, Always Be Ready, Improbable Planet, and a lot of others. So please join me in welcoming Hugh Ross.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to address you. And, I put out a book called Navigating Genesis a decade ago. So, what I'm going to mostly do in this talk is give you updates to that book. So, kind of look at this as the latest. And I'm going to mainly focus on Genesis 1 and the flood chapters, Genesis 6 through 11. I do take questions on Facebook and Twitter. So if you got questions and you don't get to ask them tonight, I do take questions both on my Facebook and Twitter page. And if you're not already a subscriber, Reasons to Believe does have a YouTube channel, and the videos go up several times a week. So Navigating Genesis, and I wrote the book basically to put out what we refer to as the two books doctrine. And that's the doctrine on which Reasons to Believe was founded, that God reveals himself in an utterly trustworthy and reliable manner through two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And this is the book, Navigating Genesis. Anyone can get a free chapter of that book at reasons.org/Ross. But I want to begin with Genesis 1:1. It's a verse I've discovered no matter where I travel in the world, everybody seems to know. Often it's the only Bible verse they know. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This particular verse poses a problem if you're addressing an audience that speaks English, Korean, or Japanese. Those are the three largest vocabulary languages in the world. And the problem with those languages, they don't often recognize that the phrase the heavens and the earth is an idiom. And small vocabulary languages have to make extensive use of idioms. Being raised and educated in Canada, I had to be fluent in French to get my PhD, and I became fluent by memorizing about 1,500 different idioms. And just like French is a small vocabulary language, Biblical Hebrew is actually 10 times smaller than French. There's only 3,000 words if you don't count the names of cities and people. And there is no word in Hebrew and Biblical Hebrew for the universe. But they have this phrase, the heavens and the earth. It means the entire creation, all matter, energy, space, and time. The reason I bring this up, if I run into skeptics who say the Bible gets it wrong from the very first sentence, because we know scientifically the universe predates the earth by many billions of years. They're simply not recognizing that this is an idiomatic phrase. And it's repeated 13 times in the Old Testament. If you look up all 13 texts, it becomes obvious that this is an idiomatic phrase for the entire universe. Now, what's great about the day we live in is we now have physics theorems that prove that indeed there's a beginning to the universe, a beginning that includes the beginning of space and time itself. And today we have over 30 of these space-time theorems. Some of them actually do avoid a beginning to the universe, but all the theorems that avoid the beginning of the universe are theorems that do not permit the existence of physical life. All space-time theorems that allow physical life to exist in the universe have the conclusion that space and time have a beginning. Space and time are created when God creates the universe. The best known of these space-time theorems is a theorem published by Arvin Vorde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin. None of them are believers, but Alexander Vilenkin wrote a book a year after the theorem was published, and this is what he said in that book. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And that problem is proof of a space-time beginning implies that there must exist a causal agent beyond space and time who creates a universe of space-time, matter, and energy. And I make it a habit to collect books by atheist physicists and astronomers who are trying to wrestle with this. The books that have been published in the past 6 years all concede deism. I mean, even Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, he says on page 173 that deism cannot be taken off the scientific table. So often they refer to themselves as atheists, but actually they're deists. They do believe there's a cause beyond the universe that creates the universe. They dispute the fact that this creator is a personal being. But there's basically no doubt anymore that a miracle working God must exist. I'm going to be debating a physicist in a couple of weeks in England. It's going to be on Zoom. But I know his position is that miracles don't happen. But how can you ask for a bigger miracle than the coming into existence of the entire universe? Well, what I'm going to do next is take you through Genesis chapter 1, basically to address this objection that, hey, there is a deistic God that exists, but that deistic God is not a personal being. Well, if we see design in the universe, and if we see that the design is preparing the way for human beings, that refutes that position because all that design and purpose implies that the God that created the universe must be a personal being with real intent, that he has intelligence, that he has knowledge, he's got creativity and power. Now, my wife always says I should have never more than 3 points in a talk, which is kind of rough because I'm used to having a dozen or more points in a talk. But these are three that'll take us through Genesis chapter 1. And the first time I picked up a Bible to give it a serious read was when I was 17 years of age. And what caught my attention the moment I looked at Genesis chapter 1 is that it perfectly follows the scientific method. And the scientific method, step one is don't interpret until you first establish the frame of reference or the point of view. And step two, don't interpret until you first establish the initial conditions. And we see that laid out in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. So in Genesis 1:1, the frame of reference is the universe as a whole. But in Genesis 1:2, we note that the frame of reference is shifted from the universe to the surface of the waters of planet Earth. So we're being told the account of creation from the perspective of an observer on the surface of the waters of Earth, below the clouds, not above the clouds. This is crucial because when you run into skeptics who say Genesis 1 teaches scientific nonsense, it's because they have not changed the point of view. If you put the point of view above Earth's clouds, then indeed Genesis 1 is teaching scientific nonsense. But if you put it on the surface of the waters, you really get a perfect fit with the record of nature. And I'll demonstrate that briefly. What you also see in Genesis 1:2 are initial conditions, namely that there's water over the whole surface of the earth. It's dark everywhere in the surface of the waters, and the earth at that time is unfit for life and empty of life. Now, the thing that caught my attention about the Bible, it was a book I had read after I read the holy books of the other major religions of the world, is just how many texts, how many chapters and books in the Bible deal with the subject of creation. And three of them actually take you through the content of Genesis 1. So Genesis 1, you kind of hit the highlights, but you get a lot more detail on what's going on in creation when you look at the parallel creation texts in Psalm 104, Proverbs 8, and Job 37, 38, and 39. And when you look at Job 38, verse 9, God speaks and he says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. So Genesis 1 tells us it was dark everywhere on the surface of the waters. Job 38 tells us why it was dark. It was dark not because there was no light. It was dark because the clouds of the primordial earth would not let any light through. And this is a little diagram here that shows you the initial conditions of the earth. That the earth began with a very deep ocean, literally thousands of kilometers deep, and a thick atmosphere that surrounded that ocean. And to give you an analogy, here's Venus. And Venus has an atmosphere 90 times thicker than what Earth has today. That atmosphere is so thick that the only visible light that gets through to the surface is at the very deep red end of the spectrum of light. Now, in planet formation, the more massive the planet and the farther away it is from its host star, the thicker the atmosphere. And so we know that Earth began with an atmosphere that was about 3 times thicker than that of Venus. And with an atmosphere that thick, roughly 200 times thicker than what Earth has today, no visible light would get through at all. Now, when I was first reading Genesis chapter 1, astronomers hadn't figured out how Earth had transformed from having a thick atmosphere to a very thin atmosphere and having a very deep ocean to having a shallow ocean. We know that it did because our planet formation models told us Earth had to start off with a very thick atmosphere and a very thick ocean. Today, we actually know how that transformation occurred, that the solar system actually began with 5 rocky planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and a planet called Theia. Theia about 2, maybe a little more times the mass of Mars, sharing an orbit very close to the orbit of the Earth. And there was a moment about 95 million years after the formation of the Earth when Theia collided with the Earth. And maybe a more accurate term is merge, because it hit the Earth when the Earth had a very deep ocean, which cushioned the collision, and almost all the heavy element material in Theia got absorbed into the Earth. The light material of both Theia and the Earth got dispersed as a debris cloud around the Earth, and that led to the formation of the moon. So it was this collision event that made Earth more massive with a thinner atmosphere, a thin layer of water, and a moon massive enough that it could stabilize the tilt of Earth's rotation axis and generate tides and actually lead to a merged magnetosphere that prevented the early sun from sputtering away over the course of 1 billion years, all of Earth's water and all of Earth's atmosphere. Details about this are described in my books, Improbable Planet and Design to the Core. And people have asked me, how well established is this model of Theia colliding with the Earth when the Earth was 95 million years old? It's now very well established. It was disputed about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, because people who had worked out these models were disturbed about the huge amount of fine tuning that the models implied. And so in the 2013 issue of Nature, one of the issues, they had all the moon formation modelers redo their models with the intent of finding a way to have this merger event take place where there wouldn't be this extraordinary amount of fine tuning. The end result was they wound up with much better models. The models were very much agreeing with one another, but the level of fine tuning was an order of magnitude greater than what they started with. And a fellow by the name of Tom Williams wrote an editorial on this where he said all this extra fine tuning is causing us to experience philosophical disquiet. Okay, moving on. What about the definition of the word day? And this is something I recognize even on my first reading of Genesis chapter 1, that this word day in the original must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are used in the text. With creation day 1, the word day is used for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's contrasting seasons, days, and years. It's using the word day for 24 hours. but in Genesis 2:4, it uses the same word yom, translated day, to refer to the entirety of creation history. That would be day as a long but finite period of time. There's actually a fourth definition, which is a portion of the daylight hours. Now, what's also caught my attention the first time I read Genesis 1 is that the first 6 days are appended with an evening was, morning was, day X, day 3, 4, 5 phrase. And I didn't know what the words for evening and morning meant in the original Hebrew, but I knew at a minimum they were telling me that there was a definite start time and a definite end time for each of those 6 days. When you get to the seventh day, there is no evening was, morning was phrase. It's missing, which indicated to me that we must still be in the seventh day. And both Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 explicitly state that we are still in God's seventh day. Romans tells us the seventh day will not end until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have in fact been redeemed. But one of the things that really encouraged me when I was reading this for the first time at age 17 is how this pattern of God creating for 6 periods of time and resting during the human era answers the fossil record enigma. Because my reading of paleontology and geophysics indicated that during the pre-human eras, we see the appearance of many phyla classes, orders, and families in the fossil record, but during the human era, we don't see none of that at all. Genesis answered that enigma. For 6 days, God creates. That's when he's bringing about all these new phyla, classes, orders, and families and genera of life. But during the human era, he ceases from his work of creation. What he does during his seventh day is focus on his work of redemption. If you want to read more about this, I've written a whole book on this issue of the days in the different creation texts of the Bible. And again, anyone can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. But let me quickly take you through the events of the creation days. Uh, Genesis 1:3, let there be light. The thing you need to notice here, the text does not say that God created the light or that God made the light. It says, let the light be. There was light when God created the universe. It was dark on the surface of the waters because the light that God created could not penetrate through the earth's clouds. What happened on creation day one, the atmosphere thinned sufficiently that light from the sun could actually pass through Earth's atmosphere, reach the waters, and this would enable photosynthetic life to exist. And you actually see a verb in the Hebrew used in Genesis 1:3. It's the verb rahap, which means to hover over or to brood over, to bring to life. And so in our book that we wrote, Fazal Rana and I, on the origins of life, we say this is an indication that God created the first life on planet Earth at the beginning of creation day one. You move into creation day two. This is the most controversial of the creation days because of the brief statement that Moses makes here. All he says is that there's water above and water below. But what you discover in the book of Job, you'll discover why Moses was so brief. The book of Job devotes a whole chapter and a half on creation day two. Not only describes how there's water above and water below, but how God has worked to circulate that water in a complex water cycle where you have three forms of frozen precipitation, snow, frost, and hail, and three different kinds of liquid precipitation, rain, mist, and dew, and implies that we need all six in order to have life abundant on the earth and human civilization globally dispersed. And we notice about the era we're presently in is that during the human era, what we notice is that the highest mountains are near the equator of the earth, and the mountains towards the poles tend to be of lower elevation. And this is what actually enables all six forms of precipitation to occur over nearly all Earth's land masses. To give you an example, the nation of Ecuador experiences all 6 forms of precipitation and actually has rivers that run all year round because there's 6 huge glaciers on Mount Chimborazo, which is less than a degree away from the equator, that provides constant meltwater. And this is why we see about the ice on planet Earth. It's designed in such a way to ensure that we can irrigate all the world's agricultural plains. Moving into creation day 3, it says, let the dry ground appear. At age 17, that was not yet established in the geological literature. In fact, this was the picture in the 1950s up through 1961. Geologists thought that the continents have always been on Earth in their present state. But when you looked at those old geology textbooks, this was all stated without any evidence or observations to support the claim. And as an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, I had the privilege of taking the first course ever taught on plate tectonics from 2 of the 4 geologists that launched the discipline. And in that course, this is what they taught, that because of plate tectonics, there's a steady growth in the continents with respect to time. I remember talking to one of the professors after class saying, I see you got it starting at 7%. Is it possible it could be 0%? I wanted to see if there was any credibility what the Bible claimed here, that indeed Earth begins as a water world. And the professor at that time said, anything between 0 and 10 will work. We just don't have the data yet. But what happened in 2018 is that a study of the deep oxygen cycle basically gave this story of the growth of the continental land masses, that for the first billion years, Earth was a water world, and then plate tectonics began to kick in, and slowly we had small cratons appear on the Earth. Those are mini continents. But with the first great oxygenation event stimulated by the deep oxygen cycle, there was a sudden growth in continental landmass area on the Earth, and then a very gradual growth thereafter. Uh, you need about 27% continental landmass coverage to efficiently recycle nutrients so that you get an abundance of life in both the oceans and on the land masses. Interestingly, 29% is optimal for global human civilization. And one of the books I have by the paleontologist Peter Ward makes the case that if we wait long enough, the continents will cover 30% of the world's land or surface area. And at 30%, we're looking at events that'll be catastrophic to human civilization. No need to worry. That's not going to happen for about another 500 million years. And this is all described in a Reasons to Believe, Today's New Reasons to Believe article that I published on June 11th, 2018. You can see it at reasons.org. And 4 times on university campuses, I have debated the executive director of the Skeptics Society, Michael Shermer. Typically, we were debating on, is there a God behind the universe? Is there scientific evidence for God? It didn't matter. Whatever the debate title, Michael Shermer spent all of his time basically blasting Genesis chapter 1. And all 4 times he said, this is a clear case where Genesis gets it wrong because the fossil record tells us we get animals in the oceans before we get vegetation on the land. And I remember responding to him during those debates saying, well, these animals in the oceans, they've got shells and skeletons, and therefore their remains will be well preserved for hundreds of millions of years. That will not be the case with vegetation. The vegetation will decay. And so, hey, it's no big surprise we don't yet have the evidence. But in 2009, a paper was published in Nature basically demonstrating that, yes, we don't have the fossils, but we have isotope evidence that vegetation was abundant on the continents for at least 200 million years before the first appearance of animals in the oceans. And in 2011, a paper got published where they said, we found fossils, more accurately, fossil parts. They found fossil remains as large as a millimeter across, that indeed vegetation was abundant on the land masses for at least 600 million years before the first appearance of animals in the oceans. Then we move into creation day 4, and it says, let there be lights in the sky. And it says, let there be lights in the sky so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. And for whose benefit? What you notice at the beginning of creation day 5, this is when God creates animals in the oceans. And animals need to be able to see the position of one or more of the sun, moon, and stars in order to regulate their biological clocks. So let there be lights in the sky, the sun, moon, and stars, so they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years for these animals that God will be creating. And this graph here shows you the oxygenation history of our first 4 billion years of planet Earth. And you see that little bump at about 2.5, 2.4 billion years. That's the bump where we see this huge rapid growth of continental land masses. But the oxygen went down to below 1% again and gradually moved up to 2% after the first 3.8 billion years. But at literally 580 million years ago, it took a sudden jump upwards. 575 million years ago, it did a burst from 2% up to 8%, generated by what's referred to as a great unconformity, where you have these huge landslides off the continents into the oceans. Those landslides did two things. They created these shallow continental shelves off the coasts of all the oceans, and also led to this huge jump in atmospheric oxygen. And what a team of physicists did in 2018, they had this big flask and they filled it with the known atmospheric composition of the early Earth. And then they gradually pumped more and more oxygen into the flask. And they noticed that when it was at 2% oxygen, you couldn't see through the flask. This is what it looked like looking through the flask. All you just saw was this amorphous, thick haze. Couldn't even see to the other end of the flask. And what I've done to simulate their experiment is basically to show you a mountain in Colorado where I'm standing about a third of a mile away. And at 2% oxygen, you can't see the mountain. But when you push the oxygen content up to about 4%, you begin to see that there's something in the background there. And as you push it up to 8%, suddenly the atmosphere goes completely clear. And for the first time, you can see something in the sky. Off to the upper right, you can see the moon. So it basically shows you that, yes, putting enough oxygen in the atmosphere will transform the atmosphere from being a thick haze where no creatures on the surface of the earth can see the sun, moon, and stars. They can see the light, but all they see is amorphous light. But once it hits 8%, you can actually see the sun, moon, and stars. Creation day 5, let the waters teem with living creatures. I believe this is a reference to the Avalon and Cameron explosions, where animals bigger than microscopic animals for the first time appear. With the Avalon explosion, you get animals as big as 2 meters across, but these are animals that don't have a circulatory system or a digestive tract or complex internal and external organs. 8% oxygen is not enough to support that. That event happened when 575 million years ago. Those creatures eventually went extinct. And at 538 million years ago, there was another jump in the oxygen content from 8% to 10%. And the moment it hit 10%, zero time delay, the moment it hit 10%, we see the sudden appearance of at least 2 dozen and maybe as many 30 distinct phyla of animals. And they show up suddenly, they show up simultaneously, they show up the moment that oxygen permits them to exist. And this has led to a number of paleontologists publishing papers where they're basically conceding a supernatural explanation for the Avalon and Cameron explosions. Gregory Ray, in a review paper, said this about the Cameron explosion, that the Cameron explosion of body plans, that is basic body plans phyla, poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution, a reference to a naturalistic explanation of the appearance of these life forms. Kevin Peterson and his colleagues wrote this, elucidating the materialistic basis for the Cameron explosion has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. And I published a paper in a mainland Chinese journal about the origin and history of Earth's life, where I basically said, hey, that was back in 2009. Since then, there's been many more papers published, basically conceding the point that it's no longer possible to explain the Cambrian and Avalon explosions naturalistically. There must be something beyond nature that explains these events. They're also conceding that's the case for the multiple mass speciation and mass extinction events that you see. And I think recently I put up a paper at reasons.org making the point that if you look at Psalm 104, verses 29 and 30 state, it's the property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. The interesting thing when you look at the fossil record is that these mass extinction events are basically events where animals and plants that are inefficient at removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere are replaced by life forms that are more efficient, and exactly more efficient in a way to compensate for the fact that the sun is getting brighter and brighter as it continues to fuse hydrogen into helium. And what I wrote in that article, only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which life forms to remove and which new life forms to replace them with. But interestingly, when you look at the fossil record, is how rapidly the mass speciation events follow after the mass extinction events. Well, this is actually part of my conversion story, because what I looked at after studying Genesis for a few hours was recognizing that once you understand that the word yom, translated day, is referring to consecutive long periods of time, that the frame of reference for interpreting the days of creation is the surface of the earth, you get a perfect score of 10 for 10 for the description of the creation events and 10 for 10 in the chronological order in which they're placed. And the best I found outside of the Bible was the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians. They got 2 to 14 right. I think they got that many right because of how that culture was so close to the culture of Abraham and of Moses. But only the Bible gets a perfect score. And notice that the Bible, in describing the events of creation, actually was predicting discoveries in advance of its time, far in advance of its time. And the more and more we learn about the record of nature, the tighter and tighter fit we get between that record of nature and what the biblical creation text said thousands of years ago. Now, one of the things you see at the close of Genesis chapter 1 is that God assigns responsibility to humanity, says that we are to be stewards of the earth. We're to manage Earth's resources for our benefit and the benefit of all their life. And that implies that God has provided for us all the resources we need to indeed manage the planet's resources for our benefit, our health benefit, our economic benefit, but also for the benefit of all other species on life. And so when it comes to environmentalism, according to the Bible, there will be win-win solutions. And I attempted to document that in the book Weathering Climate Change. And I've actually just submitted a paper to the journal Solar, headquartered in Beijing, where I basically am providing a sequel to Weathering Climate Change with a way. It's a secular journal. I don't know how it's going to survive the peer review process, but hopefully it will get published and basically demonstrate this principle, which I actually write about in the paper. Well, let me jump ahead to Noah's flood. And the book I've written on Noah's flood basically makes a case that we're not talking a flood that wipes out only a portion of humanity, it wipes out all of humanity, but you don't need to have a global flood to wipe all of humanity if the flood occurs early enough in human history where humans are in a region rather than globally distributed. Now, proof from the Bible that the flood is not global, but instead is universal or worldwide. And the point I'm making here is the Bible in many places describes worldwide events that clearly are not global. A New Testament example is where Paul says of the Roman Christians, the whole world has heard of your faith. But he meant the world of Rome, the Roman Empire. He was not implying that the Aborigines in Australia had heard of the faith of the Romans. But Psalm 104 is probably the most explicit text that establishes that the flood of Noah, though universal, was not global. Verses 6 and 7 and 8 basically are reviewing for you the events of creation day 3, where it talks about how the earth at one time was covered over completely with water, but at your rebuke, the waters fled. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. And what you see in verse 9, it's referring to God. You set a boundary that they, namely the waters, cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. So it's basically making the statement that once God transforms planet Earth from a water world to a world where you got both oceans and continents on its surface, never again from that point forward will water cover the whole surface of the earth. So that would explicitly tell us that the flood of Noah was not global in extent. In 2 Peter 3:6, it talks about the flood waters of Noah. So by water also, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. And the world of that time in the original Greek is tote cosmos. The amplified definition, the world at the time that the event took place. But here's a simpler argument. If indeed Peter meant the entire planet, he wouldn't have qualified the word cosmos. The fact that he chose to qualify cosmos tells us it's not the whole surface of the earth. It's that part of the surface of the earth that God flooded in order to achieve his purpose of wiping out reprobate humanity. And what you see in 2 Peter 2:5, God speaking about God, he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, verse 7:7, for the destruction of ungodly men. Here again, the word cosmos is qualified. It's the world of ungodly people, not the entire planet, but the entire part of the planet that was occupied by ungodly people. Now, what I try to do in the book I've brought out is to come up with a date for Noah's flood. And what we do know, according to Genesis chapter 8, it took a year for the flood waters to recede. To take that long, the flood would have to be an ice age event because water would normally flow out into the ocean and flow out relatively quickly. For the flood waters to remain for a whole year, the water flowing out into the ocean would have to be replaced by melting snow and ice. And during the last ice age, there'd be more than sufficient ice and snow in the regions surrounding the flood area, where indeed the flood could be sustained for a whole year. And when was the last ice age? 115,000 to 14,000 years ago. But what we see in Genesis 10 and 11 is that Noah's flood preceded the great migrations of humanity. Genesis 10 and 11 refer to a time after the flood when God basically told Noah and his descendants, you're to multiply and fill the earth. The same command he gave to Adam and Eve. And notice in Genesis chapter 9, that is actually repeated. And so God is making it very clear. You're not to make the same mistake that the descendants of Adam made, where they remained in one place. You're to actually inhabit the entire earth. How else can you manage the resources of the planet for your benefit and the benefit of all life? But what you see in Genesis 11 is that humanity was resolute in not being scattered over the face of the earth. And so God steps in and forcibly scatters humanity over the face of the earth. And what's brand new in this book on the flood is that for the first time, we got genetic dates and carbon-14 dates for the remains of humanity, for human artifacts, and you have the genetic signature as well. And what this data is telling us is that Tasmania, Australia, New Guinea, Japan, Borneo, Indonesia, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Africa, Siberia, they were all colonized at the same time. 49,000 to 42,000 years ago that happened. I mean, how do you explain the fact that Northern Europe was colonized at the same time as Southern Europe, colonized at the same time as Japan and Borneo, Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea, unless God was forcibly scattering humanity? And so this is now well documented, beyond any dispute. And that being that far back in time, you got land bridges joining Britain to France. Basically, a nice land bridge that joins Germany to Sweden and Norway. Land bridges that join Korea to Japan. The Indonesian islands are all joined together. Borneo is part of the mainland. And also, what I was able to slip into the book just before it went to press, a paper published literally just weeks ago documented that in Indonesia, 45,000 years ago, humans were building huge ships in order to migrate from Indonesia to Australia, ships on the same size scale as Noah's Ark. And so this basically establishes that people that far back in time indeed were capable of building the ship the size of Noah's Ark. There are 5 chapters in Navigating Genesis on the flood, but this book that'll be coming out in August 15th, it's basically an entire book devoted to this. And for the first time, I think we can give a very strong case that the most ridiculed chapters in the Bible actually are historical. They are accurate. They can be interpreted literally. The key is recognizing the flood wasn't global and recognizing the flood predated 45,000 years ago. And the point here is the more we learn about science, the more reasons we have to trust the Bible as the inspired, inerrant Word of God in everything that addresses. I see I've ended 2 minutes early, so we'll have an extra 2 minutes for questions. And let me stop the share feature here, and we'll go into, and you can ask me any question you want. It doesn't have to be about the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I think we'll try to give priority for those questions.
Well, thank you very much, Hugh. That was really great. I appreciated it. I do have, I'll start off with a question from somebody who asked me this question before your talk, but he's not here to actually ask it in person, so I'm asking it for him. And he wants to know, what is the best scientific evidence we have for when modern humans first appeared on Earth? And how precise is this evidence? And how can we reconcile the telescoping of the genealogies with that date?
Yeah, good question. And the problem is we don't have a radioisotope clock between about 45,000 years ago and 250,000 years ago. And that's where I believe God created Adam and Eve. And so the scientific dates we had for God creating Adam and Eve are not that accurate. And the problem here is when you read the scientific literature, they typically only give you the statistical errors on the dates that they use. But every one of the dates is based on indirect methods where you got enormous systematic errors. But I actually have a chapter in the new book on the flood where I get into what I consider to be the best scientific dates for God creating Adam and Eve and the best scientific date for when Noah's flood occurred. And for Adam and Eve, the best scientific dates fall between 90 and 190,000 years ago. But the error bars on those are large. And so it's possible that God could have created Adam and Eve as early or as recent as 55,000 years ago, but as far back as, say, 100 or even 200,000 years ago. That would be the range based on what you see in Genesis 2, where it talks about God putting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where four known rivers come together, two of which flow today, all four of which would have been flowing during the last ice age. And that location today for the Garden of Eden is about 200 feet below sea level. So I use that as an argument that according to Genesis, Adam and Eve were created sometime during the last ice age. And the date for the last ice age is 15,000 to 120,000 years ago. So the Bible doesn't give you a very accurate date, but it is a better date than what you get from the science. And as how you deal with the genealogies, well, we know there has to be some telescoping because even organizations like Answers in Genesis, who believe that there's zero gaps between the genealogies, when they establish a date for Noah's flood, where they go from Adam to Noah, they get a different date when they go from Moses and Abraham back to Noah. The two dates disagree by 100 years. And they just kind of throw up their hands and say, we don't know what to do with this. But I think we all know what to do with it. It basically implies that the genealogies in the Bible are not exhaustive, they're incomplete. And that's obvious when you compare the biblical genealogies. I mean, you've got a New Testament genealogy which goes from Adam all the way to Jesus, 42 generations. But if you look at other genealogies in the Old Testament, it's clear there are many more than just those 42 generations. And this is easy to understand when you recognize the Hebrew word for father, uh, Ab also means grandfather, great grandfather, great great grandfather. And you look at the book of Daniel, Belshazzar refers to Nebuchadnezzar as his father. They're not even blood related, and there's four generations between them. So hopefully that'll help.
Great, thank you. So I would ask if you have a question, raise your hand. You can do that on, is it on the participants uh, panel, Kirk? I think it's on in participants. You can raise your hand. We have one from Ari Goldberg.
I think it's on
So
React.
Ari,
I
why
think
don't
on
you go?
React.
Hi, Hugh. I've got a question about Creation Day 4. I think I asked this before in a previous session, and Kirk and Kirby knew the answer, but I forgot, so I'll ask it again. But the um, the sun and moon already existed prior to the fourth day, but in Genesis 1:16 it says, "Then God made true great lights," and the
Right.
Hebrew word is vayas from the root word oseh, which is to make. And I would contrast that in with verse 9, where it says, "Then God said, let the waters under heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. So that is from the root word roeh, which is to
Right.
see. And so I'm wondering, why did Moses choose to use the word for make rather than let appear?
Well, I think he did because God's the one that's responsible for stars coming into existence. I mean, he created the universe in such a way that there'd be galaxies, stars, and planets. So I think it's appropriate to see the statement, God made the sun, moon, and stars, rather than just kind of allowing them to appear. What's important about verse 16 is that the Hebrew verb form there does not imply that God made the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. It's basically saying they're finished. God had made them. Doesn't tell us when they made them, but based on what we see in Genesis 1:1 and 1:3, we would recognize that the sun, moon, and stars were made before the events of creation day one. The light of the sun, moon, and stars appears on the surface at creation day one, and in day four, creatures on the surface of the earth, because of the sky now becoming transparent, can see where these objects are in the night sky or the day sky in terms of the sun and moon.
All right, thank you.
I see that Malian Padidar has a question. Malian, are you there? Could you go ahead and ask your question? I don't see him showing up, so I'm going to go ahead and ask his question for him. He says, in what order should we read your books, Hugh?
Oh, whatever order you like.
That's
No,
that's a cheap shot.
no, what I tell people is, look, I wrote these books to be tools that you could use to share with unbelievers in the hope that what's in those books would persuade them to receive Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. And the reason I've written so many books is that every non-Christian is different. And so I basically encourage people, ask good questions, find out what the issues are for the friend you're talking to, and then give them an appropriate book and be prepared to follow up. And so what book should you start with? I'd say start with a book that is probably going to be of interest to the people you know around you.
Okay.
Tom's got a hand up, Kirby.
Who?
Tom?
Okay. Tom Canaday, you got a question?
I do. Thank you. Uh, I've heard people, skeptics, say that uh, sort of the genetic wherewithal that humans share is such that there could not ever have been two. There could not have ever have been just one man and one woman. That there was some minimum level of population, and the numbers I've heard bandied about are like 10,000 or something like that, and only if you had that many individual humans would you have enough genetics to explain the genetic diversity that we have today. And so I wonder if is that argument ringing any bells with you? Have you heard that before or something like that? And how would you respond to that?
Yes, that was popularized by Francis Collins in his book, The Language of God. And he actually quoted the number 10,000. So I remember the first time I met Francis, he says, this is indisputable. It's at least 10,000. It could be more. You people with reasons to believe just need to accept reality. That led to us doing a Two Views book that you'll see in our catalog, Old Earth and Evolutionary Creationism, where we basically had a friendly debate. And it's one thing I admired about Francis Collins. He came to me and says, look, we know that this science faith issue is highly controversial in the Christian community and very divisive, and that the Christians seem to be quite vicious towards one another in this subject matter. How about if we do a Two Views book where we're very forthright about where we disagree about the science in the Bible, but we treat one another charitably? But to get specific to your question, I debated a couple of times now the past president of BioLogos, the organization that was founded by Francis Collins, and that would have been Deborah Harzma. And I told her I was older than her. It says, I remember when they were saying that the ancestral population of humanity was 1 million. And then it dropped to 100,000. And then we have Francis Collins saying 10,000. And when my colleague Fazal Rana debated Dennis Venema, Dennis was saying 800. I said, maybe we need to plot a chart and see where it's going. It seems to be heading down towards the biblical two. But what you'll see in the book that we did with them is that what we note is that the more complex the mammalian species and the longer their generation time, the time between them being born and being able to give birth, that you discover that you generate way more genetic diversity than what the mathematical genetics models predict. And so, there's actually been field experiments done that prove this. And so they've done field experiments now with 8 different species of birds and mammals. And in every single case where you begin with, say, a genetic couple, where you have measured DNA and you let them reproduce for several generations, you always get way more genetic diversity than what's predicted by the mathematical genetics models. And it's in direct proportion to the generation time. And of course, we humans have the longest generation time of any animal species. I mean, these days it's like 30 years, right? It used to be 20, but now people seem to wait longer to get married and have children. And so, in that context, there's no problem with the biblical two. I have an update on that in the book on the flood, where I basically say neither is there a problem with having all of humanity descended from the 8 people on board Noah's Ark. That even the genetics models we have today are consistent with the biblical date for Noah's flood. And I would argue those genetics models are at best giving us an upper limit to the number of individuals.
Thank you.
I see that David has a question about quantum tunneling. David, could you unmute yourself and maybe ask what
Yeah.
that question is?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks you for that great presentation. I just had a question. Alexander Vilenkin mentioned that the universe could have instantaneously come out of due to a quantum tunneling effect out of nothing. Can you just comment on that a little bit?
Yes, that has appeared in many books by atheists. The one who's devoted the most to that approach has been Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing.
Mhm.
And quantum tunneling can't happen without time. And the space-time theorems tell us the beginning of the universe is the beginning of time, which means you can't have quantum events until after time actually exists. And you'll see 2 big reviews I've written on Lawrence Krauss's book on our reasons.org website. If you just put in the name Krauss, it'll pop up.
Mhm.
And basically what I've done in my critique of his book is said all of his appeals to creation of nothing are something. In fact, he introduces 9 different kinds of nothing.
Right.
Every one of his nothings is something. So, and
Yes.
so for example, you can get virtual particles coming out of space-time foam, but they're not coming out of nothing. They're coming out of the space-time foam, and they actually can revert back to the space-time foam. We call them virtual particles because these are particles with mass that quantum tunnel out of the space-time foam, but they go back to the space-time foam before a human observer can actually observe the particle. That's why we call them virtual. We know they happen, but we can't hold one in our hand because they go back to the quantum space-time foam so very rapidly. And here's where the real challenge comes with appealing to quantum tunneling. the snapback time, where it reverts back to the space-time foam, is proportional to the mass that you bring into existence. So for these virtual particles, which have a mass equivalent to about an electron, they snap back in less than a trillionth of a second. For the universe, it snaps back in less than 10 to the minus 122 seconds. And even young Earth creationists would agree that the universe is a lot older than 10 to the minus 122 seconds. So those theoretical appeals don't work.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, I see.
Dirk Meyer has his hand raised.
Well, Dirk Meyer, I think, is next. So, Dirk, go ahead. Dirk Meyer.
Well, Phyllis also has her hand raised.
Yeah, I've got a couple of people here, but Kurt,
You
Dirk,
need to unmute.
here we go. He's on a computer with no camera or mic. He says, Dr. Ross, have you had a chance to examine Robert Gentry's book, Creation's Tiny Mystery? And if so, do you have a take on his notion of a young Earth based on polonium halos?
Yes, I do, and I address this in some detail in the book A Matter of Days, the second edition. And so he makes a big deal about these polonium halos. What he's not acknowledging is that his halos are disputed by atomic physicists. What is not disputed are thorium halos and uranium halos. And those clearly indicate we're looking at Earth that's billions of years old. So he's using an anomalous thing that is disputed as a way to overturn evidence in the same discipline that is not disputed at all. So it's not evidence for a young Earth.
And then I think our next question was from Phyllis. Phyllis, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, Phyllis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ross. My question is, and I do plan to get Noah's Flood because I'm in a class year every year from September to May where we study the book. Today, we just finished the book of Revelation. It's my fourth time around. But what I want to know is, do you have the scientific side of Revelation? Because it's very symbolic with John and his writing, but it's also a lot of cross-reference from the Old Testament to the New Testament. That's my first question. And then, because we'll revert back to the Old Testament next year, but can I get your books that are from Genesis to Revelation that really gives a scientific view of the Bible from each book of the Bible? Do you have that, like, I don't know if it's numeric or you just cover different topics?
Well, I did do a study on Genesis where I went through all 50 chapters, and I got notes in every chapter and study questions for the students, so I can get that for you.
Okay.
Navigating Genesis takes you through the first 11 chapters. The book I got out in the flood covers Genesis 6 through 11. But what I also do in both those books is cross-reference other chapters, other books of the Bible that are relevant. I mean, one of the big things I do in the book on the flood that I got coming out is say there's actually more content on Noah's flood outside of Genesis than in Genesis. And therefore, I said, if you actually look at all 66 books, I think you can get a good resolution to these controversies. Concerning Revelation, the church where I serve as a pastor, some 40 years ago, asked me to teach on the book of Revelation. And I said, well, if I do that, we're going to have to study a lot of the Old Testament, because my view is that Revelation basically is a capstone to all the Old Testament prophetic books. And so we wound up studying a third of the Old Testament when we went through our class on the book of Revelation. And that's what I did. I tried to pull together the science to give some elucidation on what's going on in Revelation, and also made the point, yes, there's some symbols in Revelation, but they're either defined in the book itself, like you see in Revelation 1, where it tells us stars are a symbol for angels. So there it's explicit. But I took the position, I'm not going to read Revelation figuratively or symbolically unless I see the symbol defined somewhere else in the Bible. But most of the Revelation symbols are defined in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah. And so that's why we had to look at all those Old Testament books. The class took me 7 years to teach. And so our church refers to my teaching as a 7-year tribulation. However, one of our class members actually took those 7 years, edited out all the repetitive material and summaries, edited out the class announcements. And so it's all available now on 4 MP3s. So if you want to listen to that 7-year class, you can do it in a lot less than 7 years.
That would be great, because what I usually do when we're out, because we ended last week, is just go back on my own. It becomes my own personal study for the summer while I'm waiting to resume in the fall, but reviewing everything we study. And like I said, I've gone through Revelation 4 times, but I never have done it through the scientific side, which I think would be a plus for me on that.
Yeah, that's particularly helpful as you get into Ezekiel and Isaiah. That's where you're going to see a lot of the science.
Science.
And you can download those MP3s for free at paradoxes.org.
Paradoxes.org. Okay, great. Because I've done Ezekiel and those rest too, but not look, like I said, not looking at it from the scientific. So I'm going to really enjoy this for the summer. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, I see Kimberly has a couple of questions. Kimberly, can you unmute yourself and share your questions with us, please?
Okay, so first off, I teach children that are a lot younger, and I would like to maybe start some good conversations with some of them, let's say 5th grade. Now, I know that probably a majority of the people that are on this call are probably college professors, etc. So that's so what I'm looking at is I was wondering if any of you guys have ever thought or have or know of a book that I can get for younger children that would start this whole scientific conversation around creationism.
Yeah, Kimberly, if you go to reasons.org, the store, you'll find a number of items that are geared for children. And children like to watch videos. So we got some videos I think would be right up their alley. One that I've personally found works really well with children as young as 5 years of age is a video we have called Beyond the Cosmos. I've written a book on Beyond the Cosmos, but we also have a DVD. And what I've noticed is children seem to get it way faster than adults.
Yeah, they do. Or I should say, yes. These days, though, things are changing, as you guys all probably know. And so the better we can get it into these young minds.
Kimberly, did you want to, I mean, you skipped over the first question that you had. Did you want to skip over that one, or did you want to ask it? About Adam and Eve and the dinosaurs?
Oh, that one. Yes. I was thinking, well, maybe I should. No, okay. Yeah, I should ask that. Okay. Because I've heard that before many, many times that Adam and Eve walked with the dinosaurs. And I was like, is there really scientific evidence around that or not? I haven't had the chance to look, I'll be honest. But so what do you think?
Well, the only evidence for that is at the Creation Museum. You can actually get your picture taken on top of one of their animatronic dinosaurs. Psalm 104 is really the text to go to. Psalm 104 basically declares that God has packed our planet with as much life as possible and as diverse as possible. which
Mhm.
would imply when conditions were appropriate for dinosaurs, he would have created dinosaurs. They're not appropriate now or at the time of Adam and Eve, because in order to have these creatures that are walking around that are weighing 50 to 80 tons, they would need water support. The biggest animal you can have without water support is an elephant. And so these dinosaurs that were bigger than elephants, they would need to be wandering around in shallow seas. And 60 to 230 million years ago, the continents were covered with huge shallow seas. Over half of North America, for example, was covered over with shallow seas. What I mean by shallow seas, like 10 to 30 feet of water. And so when you watch Jurassic Park, T-Rex was probably moving in water to capture its prey. It wasn't chasing jeeps on dry land. A creature that tall and that big would suffer severe injury if it tried to move that fast on dry land. But in water, no problem. The water would have protected it and it would have been able to move around. And these big, huge creatures with their long necks, they were basically feeding on vegetation at the bottom of shallow seas. And the point is, whatever the condition geologically or geographically of the earth, God's going to fill it with as much life as possible and as diverse as possible. But during the human era, conditions are not appropriate for animals that big. They simply wouldn't have been able to survive.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Just kind of a follow-up on that question, Hugh. Would you comment on I believe there are some evidences of human footprints and dinosaur footprints in the same plaster or same casts somewhere on Earth. And
Yeah, and just to be, if you want to read about dinosaurs and all the controversies on them, they are covered in the book A Matter of Days. In that same book, I deal with the footprints. And the problem is that these human footprints have been misinterpreted. If you actually look carefully at the prints, you'll see there's a claw behind the heel. Well, humans don't have a claw behind the heel. And what's really going on, these are prints in a riverbed. And whenever you're walking around in a clay riverbed area, when you pull your foot out of the mud, what happens is the print collapses partially. And so they've been able to go back to those so-called human footprints. And with a toothbrush, they basically erode away the mud that filled in and they recover a three-toed dinosaur print.
Mhm.
So the prints are all dinosaur prints. They're not human prints.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you. Randy Morgan, I'm sure you have been eager to ask questions, and so it's your turn now. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, and I thank you. Thank you, Hugh, for being here. People who are in this group locally know that I have a hard time with everything. But the source of my difficulty, being agnostic, is mostly due to why we have to depend on human beings to convey God's message. Why we're if God really wants us to know him, why is he making it so difficult for us who are really searching? I don't get it. And everybody's got a book to read, and I've read a lot of them. I don't want to read any more book from people. I just don't want to read books by people. Everyone's got a view. That's what makes us fallible. If God really wanted us to know him after thousands and thousands of years, why are we still arguing about it? Why are we still having wars in the world? It makes no sense to me.
Randy, you're raising some good issues. And, when you talk about humans, the Bible tells us that we're imperfect, and therefore you should expect there's going to be disputes and misinterpretations.
But the Bible's imperfect because it was written by human beings.
Well, the Bible was written by human beings, But Peter, for example, says that God inspired the human authors to record truth
But
and
that's
nothing but truth.
Hugh, that's coming from the book that I'm having problems with. So you see the
Well,
kind of the
I
circular
understand all
problem.
that, but I'm just encouraging you. You can put it to the test. I mean, I was not raised in a Christian home. I was very skeptical. But what caught my attention about the Bible, it says, test everything, hold true, hold fast that which proves to be good and true. And so the other holy books I read basically were trying to discourage me from testing. The Bible alone said, put it to the test. It's the Bible that's the source of the scientific method. And so, and keep in mind, according to the Bible, God himself visited planet Earth and lived amongst us as a human being and proved his divinity by living a perfectly moral life. What caught my attention in the Bible is Jesus before a large crowd that included his mother and his four brothers and his sisters basically said, I am morally perfect. And everybody nodded their heads and agreed with him.
Is
Now,
Jesus God?
pardon me? Yes.
Is Jesus God?
According to the Bible, Jesus is God. And as you read the Bible, what you notice is he lived amongst us and lived a morally perfect life that no other human was able to do, and then performed miracles to establish his divinity. And he did it in front of large crowds. And even his enemies admitted they couldn't deny the miracles he performed. And after he was raised bodily from the dead, you notice within just a few weeks, half the population of Jerusalem becomes followers of Jesus Christ.
But
And so,
again, it's the Bible that's telling me that. So,
well,
and
there's extra biblical sources you can go to.
hold on. Well, like Josephus, there's two places in Josephus where he talks about the Bible. One of them, scholars can agree that it was even written by Josephus. They believe that it was put there by early members of the church to help convince people that creation, just because for the problem that I'm asking. And so, but hold
Well,
on.
yeah, he's not alone. I mean, the
He
Roman historian Tacitus also writes about Jesus
does.
and the rapid church. And there's manuscripts that have been dated, establishing they're not late, they're early. There's a
And
book by F.F. Bruce you can read.
I'm not going to read any more books by
Okay.
people. That's just it. That's my problem. I'm tired of reading books. I've wasted so much time. And there's other religions out there that make more sense to me. And people know that Spinoza's God makes much more sense to me from the idea of the Big Bang. But Spinoza's God is not a personal God. He's not gonna, and the other thing I don't get, why is sacrifice a good thing? That's an ancient thing. How can anybody sacrifice something and expect them to be relieved of any guilt that they have? But hold on. There's one big question that I have to get at. That's probably the most difficult thing for me, since Jesus is God, and I assume that also includes the God of the Old Testament. And when I read the God of the Old Testament, when I read Genesis, I'm absolutely disgusted. It gives me every reason. Well, not necessarily just Genesis, but books beyond that. And my classic example is Numbers 31. In fact, I heard where God told Moses to essentially murder, create, well, you know the story.
Yes.
To murder everyone of the Midianites, and including the children. And I heard a recent, and I have a problem with this. I'm a father, right? I'm a father of a daughter, and I have a great difficulty that God is doing this, and I don't see this as an act of God. In fact, God didn't kill them; men killed them. And I visualize this. Men, I heard William Lane
Craig.
Thank you. William Lane Craig say something I found absolutely despicable. when he was talking about this. He was talking, someone else had a similar question. And he said, well, God can kill anyone he likes. God didn't kill those people. Men killed those people. Soldiers killed those people. A powerful man, Moses, ordered the soldiers to kill those people. And did he kill them all? No, he did not. He left the young virgin girls who just witnessed their families slaughtered by men who represent God. And then he ordered those girls to be given to the soldiers as quote unquote booty. In other words, that implies that for sexual favors, to be raped. How is that a just and moral and good God? Now, I've often contended that I like Jesus. I do not like, nor do I want to spend any time with the God of the Old Testament.
Okay, this is a common question where people think the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament. You say you like Jesus. What Jesus told his disciples was, after I rise from the dead, you'll become the salt of the earth. You will preserve the earth in a way that was not possible in the Old Testament times.
What I like about Jesus is his behavior in general, not
Yes.
necessarily that his adherence to or
Well, let me finish here, because what's happening in the Old Testament, you have entire nations and cities that have become reprobate in their evil behavior. And what the Bible means by reprobate, where they're incapable.
Hold on. Including the children?
Yes, including the children, including even their animals in some cases.
So you're saying that children deserve to be murdered?
Well, what I'm talking about is how in the Old Testament time, you had societal reprobation. And what you're struggling with.
But you also have an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God, right?
Yeah, hang on. What you notice in the New Testament, 0 examples of societal reprobation. Yes, we do have individuals, say Joe Stalin, Adolf Hitler, that manifest what looks like reprobate behavior, but you don't have entire cities or nations. It's just a few isolated individuals. But
but still, you're not addressing it's okay.
Let him go, Randy. He'll get there.
Yeah, Randy.
You keep interrupting, Randy. Let him talk.
So let me interrupt for just a second, Hugh. So I'm delighted that Randy has stuck with us for as many meetings as he has, and he's been asking questions like this every meeting. So and thank you for sharing with us. But please, Randy, give Hugh a chance to finish what he's saying, and stop interrupting him. And he will stop when he's done.
Yeah, and Randy, the key point is God has not changed. Humanity has changed. In the Old Testament, you had societal reprobation, and it was quite prevalent throughout the world and had to be dealt with. In the New Testament era, because the salt of the earth is now present on the earth, there's no longer any incidence of societal reprobation. Now, when you look at what the Old Testament says about societal reprobation, it refers to it as a spiritual malignancy. So let me give you an example. A medical doctor talks to you and says, you have a stage 4 malignant tumor. But here's the good news. We can surgically operate and remove it and save your life. And you want that surgeon to do everything he can to destroy that tumor. Because if he doesn't, your entire body will be infected. Well, likewise, what the Old Testament teaches, societal reprobation is in that same category. If left alone, it will be malignant. It will spread. And so we have God dealing, for example, with Sodom and Gomorrah, basically saying, if we leave that situation alone, this cancer will spread and infect the entire human species. It needs to be surgically removed. But the other thing you notice is God never performed surgery without sending a prophet to call the people to repent. So God basically gives them an opportunity to be delivered from their reprobation. But notice you see no examples of that in the New Testament era, not in the Bible and not in history. I mean, if you read history, there's zero examples of societal reprobation after the life of Jesus. Before the life of Jesus, it's quite rampant. And there are times when God has to surgically deal with it. And you made the example. Some cases, he says, just the adults have to be dealt with. Other cases, it's the adults and the children. In the extreme cases, it's the adults, the children, and their animals. But it's like a surgeon. He only removes the malignant tumor. He leaves the healthy tissue alone. And so there's different degrees of disease. And probably the best example of this is the book of Judges, where you see in different situations, God deals with the spiritual malignancy in different ways. But the best analogy is that of a caring surgeon who does everything he can to remove the disease, but does everything he can to protect the healthy tissue.
A caring surgeon who happens to be omnipotent and all-knowing and all, by definition, all good, wouldn't send in men with swords to young children to butcher them and to be raped. I mean, and I know people argue with me that, well, it wasn't rape, it was, I had someone say it was marriage. It was forced marriage. Well, I don't know what you say, but you're sending.
Well, Randy,
let me finish this one statement. You're sending young. Well, no, and I mean, this is. Are you a father?
I am a father, and I've read these
Okay.
biblical texts, Randy. Notice that the women always had the option to say no. So
where does it say that in Numbers 31?
Well, again, there's 66 books in the Bible. Before you draw a conclusion on a doctrine like that, you need to read everything that the book says about these women that are left remaining from the operation. And what you notice is it wasn't a forced marriage, it wasn't forced rape.
How can you say that? I mean,
okay, I'm
read
sorry.
the text.
I'm sorry, Randy and Hugh. I'm going to have to interrupt here because Randy, you're taking over the meeting, and that's not good. It's not fair to everybody else. So you've had your chance, and you'll just have to mull over what Hugh says, and if it's not satisfactory to you, I'm sorry, but
no, that's fair. That's fair.
So,
well,
yeah. So anyway, there are a number of other people now who have asked questions, and let's see. So I think Ari, you're first. Ari, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Hugh. I'm just curious, maybe this is just a quick no answer, but I'm not sure. But do you expect any changes in creation, like such as the laws of physics or anything during the millennial rule of Christ, if you believe in that? Will there still be volcanoes and earthquakes and hurricanes and that type of thing?
Yeah, my quick answer is no. There will be a change in the laws of physics when we enter the new creation. But as long as we're in this universe, the laws of physics will remain immutable. You see that explicitly stated in Jeremiah 33, that there will be no change in the laws of physics as long as the universe exists. But Romans 8:23 does say when the full number of humans that God will redeem from their sin and evil are in fact redeemed, that's when the laws of physics will change. But that will not be the millennium, it'll be the new creation.
Got it. Okay. Another question is that from what I recall from some of your podcasts, if I have this wrong, please correct me, but I believe you have the position that about climate change, that man's impact is significant and we need to do something about it. And I tend to agree with the climate skeptics, many of whom were quite reputable academics from MIT, Princeton, and so forth. And I'm just wondering, can you summarize some of the key points in which you differ with the climate skeptics and why?
Yeah, I've actually addressed that in a paper I just submitted to the journal Solar. So again, assuming it survives peer review, it actually has a fairly lengthy section on reviewing the whole scope of the scientific literature on global warming and basically makes the point there is no paper that survives dispute that says that humans are not by far the primary cause. And, there's surveys done independent of me where they say 99% of the peer-reviewed literatures actually identifies humans as the primary cause. I look at the 1% and say every one of those papers has been disputed and refuted by their peers. In fact, in one case, the most famous one was by a University of Alabama climatologist, and the journal editor resigned, taking responsibility for the fact. He said the paper should have been rejected because of claims made by, his first name was Roy. I'm trying to remember
Bruce
his last.
Spencer.
Yeah, Roy Spencer. Basically said he published a paper based on data that everybody had agreed was incorrect, and that the managing editor of the journal failed to spot that. The peer reviewers also failed to spot that, and hence they resigned, taking responsibility for the fact that they missed Roy Spencer's data that had been already refuted and shown to be invalid. And then in the article, I explained what it was. He was basically claiming that there was cloud dynamics that played a bigger role than human fossil fuel burning. And the cloud dynamics actually goes the other way. It's actually a cooling effect. It's not a warming effect. And
Right.
what's really refuted that is we now have temperature measurements over the oceans. And that's kind of what's new that I put in the paper, is that previous attempts to try to figure out what was going on with climate change relied on temperature records on the continents. And the problem with that is you got an elevation effect. If the thermometer is up 3,000 feet, you're going to get a different reading than if it's at sea level. And ground cover is going to be a factor. And with continents, you've got humidity that's varying it. What they've now done is they've got temperature proxies taken 100 to 200 kilometers offshore of all the world's continents. And for the first time, we've got a reliable record of climate change that goes back 24,000 years. And what I found really interesting, it documents that between 900 AD and 1950 AD, the climate was the most stable it's ever been in human history. Stable to plus or minus 0.06 degrees centigrade, which explains how it is our technology so rapidly advanced in that 1,000 year period. With that extreme climate stability, human technology just catapulted from where it was in 900 AD. And the problem we now face is we're overdoing the compensation. The natural cycles are cooling the planet. Human activity is warming it. But since 1950, human activity has now accelerated considerably beyond the natural cooling effects. But I argue in this paper, we can fix everything while we boost the world economy and boost it very substantially. That we need to use a multiplicity of solutions, not a single solution, and that we can actually take care of this probably within 10 or 12 years, and with a much stronger economy than we got now. And what I read in those papers where they were denying human activity, they were denying it because they saw the solutions as being economically punitive and actually enhancing power for the governments of the world. And so I wrote the paper making the point, we don't need political interference. There's enough economic incentive to solve the problem without having to pass punitive laws. And once that's on the table, suddenly these, people like Roy Spencer, I think they got a point that people are using global warming as a political weapon. But with good economics, we can take that weapon away.
Thank you. And by the way, my compliments on how you answered Randy's skepticism. You made some great points. So I'm going to remember those.
Okay, Phyllis, your turn. You're muted, Phyllis, so unmute yourself.
I'm here. I just have a quick question, and I don't know if it's a quick answer, but I see it in my studies, and don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to technology because I've worked in the field my first half of my career in engineering with, programming and what they can do. But my question is how people relate to AI as it is like the end all of everything. And I keep saying God didn't make robots. And I see it so much with even Christians. It's like the greatest thing since sliced bread. And my question is, and I always address them and say, aren't you concerned about something that starts with artificial? It's like give it some thought. And how is that in the Christian environment? How do you address that when it comes to, I guess you could say scientifically, because it seems to be taking over and people aren't thinking for themselves, whereas AI is just someone else thinking for you and programming it.
Well, AI is a tool. It can be used
Correct.
for good or it can be used for evil. The challenge of AI is how rapidly it's expanding. And so, it's literally exponentially growing. And how can we keep pace with the ethics given how rapidly AI is advancing? That's the challenge we're facing. And so that's one reason why we give quite a bit of thought to this at Reasons to Believe, because we realize this is different from the invention of gunpowder, where we had some time to think through some of the issues. Uh, you know, but I personally think AI is a good thing. And by the way, we've had it for a long time. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you had to have people running elevators. Now we have an AI system that runs the elevator with anybody having to control it. So AI is basically way beyond that now, where, what I love about it, I can take one of my books that's written at a graduate level and tell AI, turn this into a comic book. It'll do it. It'll do all the coloring. It'll put some humor in there that I want, and it does all that in a couple of minutes. So it's amazing what it can do, but it's important to understand the limitations. AI is very fast and good at analyzing databases we feed into it. And the bigger the databases we feed into it, the more astounding are its results. But it can't reason. I mean, to give you an
That's my
example, the biggest AI system in the world today is Minerva. It's more
point.
than 3 times bigger than Chat GPT. And they gave it a specialized diet. The only databases fed into Minerva are mathematics textbooks and lots of solutions of math problems. But when they turned Minerva loose on a standard grade 9 algebra test, it got 50% right and 50% wrong. What it got right are the algebra problems that it could copy, where the solutions were all there. It just looked for them and just spit it out. But some of the problems required original reasoning, and Minerva just is not capable of that. And no AI system is capable of ever. It can't develop new databases. It can only develop databases that are fed into it.
Into it.
But here's where things get deceptive. There's some AI systems where we fed so much data into it, it looks like it's producing a new database. What it's doing is it's organizing in a new way databases that have already been fed into it. But hey, a day is coming when you'll no longer have to drive your car. AI will drive it for you. And,
Gary.
well, scary, but look at what could happen to our economy if 10 million truck drivers could now be doing more productive work. It's going to be a huge boost to the world economy. So we got a lot to look forward to. I think there won't be, already they got robots that do surgery on you. I think a time will happen soon when all the surgeries will be done by robots. But we need to be careful because AI already in China, for example, they don't have to use facial recognition to watch what you're doing. They can now identify you by the way you walk. And so, because what I've seen in mainland China, people wear hoodies to try to hide their face from all the cameras. And the Chinese government realized, okay, we can overcome that. We're going to figure out who they are just by the way they walk. And it's really hard to hide the way you walk from the cameras. And as you're aware, in China, they watch your behavior and they punish you for behavior they don't like and reward you for behavior you do like. So Big Brother is already here. And it could happen in the United States. So yes, it's a force for good, but it can also be a force for bringing about a new world order. So you've probably read the book 1984.
Yes.
2084 is happening, and it's going to happen a lot sooner than 2084.
Thank you.
Randy, you've got your hand raised and have had it raised for a while, so you go ahead. And
Okay.
I think this might be the last question, unless I'm missing one, but let's pretend that this is the last one. And if I see another hand or another chat question, I'll interject it. But if not, then this will be the last question.
Okay, great. And thanks for just this has been a great discussion. And Hugh, I love all of the nuance that goes through all of this. And what one of my questions and one of the things that really just grabs me with the creation narrative is Genesis 1:1, sort of the concept of creation ex nihilo, and also specifically how in the first part of the 20th century people you know, but because of Einstein and a suite of others, kind of locked onto the idea that there's a time-space continuum that had a point of origin, and whether you call it the Big Bang or but just sort of the evidence behind that. And one question I had is just after, let's say, 1950 or 60, were there big scientific papers or discoveries that kind of further that added either additional force or nuance to the idea of just a point of origin in which the time-space continuum began?
Yeah, I've written about the history of that in the book, The Fingerprint of God. There's an update in the fourth edition of The Creator and the Cosmos, and how it was a Belgian priest that first formulated the Big Bang creation model back in 1925. He was a priest, but he was also an astrophysicist. But when that came out, most astronomers were quite adamant that there was no Big Bang and no beginning. They especially didn't like the fact that the universe, according to the Big Bang, was only a few billion years old. They really wanted to salvage Darwin's theory of a naturalistic biological evolution. And therefore, for about the first half of the 20th century, there was a major debate where people were reluctantly accepting the Big Bang, but trying to make the universe quadrillions of years old rather than billions of years old. You mentioned the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s is a satellite was sent up that proved that the radiation left over from the creation event had very subtle temperature differences, and later follow-ups showed that those temperature differences fit right on top of major galaxy clusters and voids between the galaxy clusters. And so literally every year that's gone by, there has been tests performed on the Big Bang, and the Big Bang has passed every test. The latest ones have been done by the James Webb Space Telescope. The one that I think is most spectacular is that the Big Bang creation model predicts the universe begins with only hydrogen. After the first 4 minutes of the universe is 25% helium and 75% hydrogen. And so astronomers have been saying, can we really test that? The James Webb just did that, about 8 months ago, where they found a gas cloud in the halo of a new formed galaxy, and the spectrometer in the James Webb Space Telescope affirmed that indeed that gas cloud only had hydrogen and helium and no heavier elements. So that's the latest test of Big Bang cosmology.
Great. Wow. Thank
Yeah,
you.
but I'd add this. The reason why there was such a disturbance about the Big Bang when it was proposed is because Jewish theologians writing 800, 900, 1,000 years ago looked at biblical texts and based on those biblical texts stated that the universe must have a space-time beginning. It must be expanding from that space-time beginning under laws of physics that don't change, where the universe gets cooler and cooler in a highly predictable way. So the Bible literally predicted the Big Bang creation model 2,600 years before George Lemaitre discovered it scientifically in 1925. The Bible said it first.
Kirby, I think I've been remuting Fred Franklin or Larry Harper, and one of them has a question for you.
Yes, but before I get to that, I have a question from Oganaya Uma. So Oganaya, would you unmute your text and ask your question?
Okay.
Then we'll go to Larry Harper next.
I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers of this meeting and to Dr. Ross for this meeting. My question is this: as Christians led by the Holy Spirit, is there a limit towards reconciling science and faith? Like, are there boundaries, a place where we shouldn't go further than this, where we should stop? And should there be limits to this? For instance, the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, they are primarily spiritual beings, but they have effects on our world, on our seen world. They have physical effects. Can we investigate this? The Bible says, test all truths and hold fast that which is true. Is this all inclusive? Because it has been my experience with most Christians that, well, they believe this because it's in the Bible, but there are questions that you start to ask, and they kind of put you on hold. That, okay, you're going too far. You're trying to reconcile science to this spiritual or faith question. So how far are we willing to go to reconcile science and faith? Basically, that's my question.
Well, my opinion is that we should go as far as the science and the Holy Spirit will allow us to go. And we can go pretty far. So, for example, these space-time theorems establish there must be a creative agent beyond space and time that created the universe. But there are limits. I mean, yes, there are limits to how far we can go with the science. I kind of look at God's book of nature and God's book of scripture as two independent revelations from God, where they overlap and corroborate one another, but they overlap only to a degree, which means they still have independence with respect to one another. And a good analogy is what happens in a court of law. If you've got two expert witnesses that are truthful and independent, that corroborate one another to a limited degree, that's considered to be a powerful argument for the lawyer representing them. But if they overlap too much, you can say, well, maybe there's collusion going on here, or they don't overlap enough, they don't corroborate one another. And with respect to the limits of science, we are limited to discovering things within the space-time realm of the universe. So, for example, it's possible that God made 10,000 other universes. But it was Einstein who made the point that once you got observers in one universe, those observers can never discover the characteristics of any other possibly existing universe. So in that sense, science is limited to speculation about what exists beyond the universe, other than there certainly must be a causal agent that exists beyond the universe. But then we can look at the design features of the universe and actually determine some of the characteristic attributes of the creator. Romans 1 says that the book of nature not only reveals that there is a God, it reveals the attributes of that God. And this is where the fine-tuning argument plays a role. And so my latest book, Designed to the Core, I make the point that we not only see fine-tuning that makes the existence of life possible in the universe, we see orders of magnitude more fine-tuning for a universe that contains plants and animals, and orders of magnitude more fine-tuning for it to include the equivalent of human beings, and orders of magnitude more fine-tuning where billions of humans can be redeemed from their sin and evil and enter into a relationship with one another and with God, where there's no sin that blocks the love that they can express to one another.
Hugh, thank you very much for this. I actually have two more people that have asked questions. Can we ask, do you have time or energy to answer or try to answer these questions, or shall we stop now?
Two more. Okay.
Two more. Okay. Larry Harper on Fred Franklin's computer. Go ahead.
Yeah. I have a question about the splitting of South America and Africa. How long would that take, and how does that fit in with the flood creation idea?
Yeah, I addressed that in the book coming out on the flood, because those who hold to a global flood claim that during Noah's flood, you had a supercontinent, Rodinia, that split into multiple continents, came back together as Pangea, and split apart into the 7 continents we have today. That all that happened within 5 months. And I argue that the Bible says the laws of physics haven't changed. And in order to have that much plate tectonic movement happening during the flood, you would need certain laws of physics to change by a factor of 1 billion times. The Bible rules that out. Astronomical observations also rule that out. Every time we astronomers look at a star or a galaxy and get a spectrum of that star and galaxy, we are measuring the laws of physics when the light left that star or galaxy. Those astronomical measurements prove what the Bible stated. There's been zero change in the laws of physics since the cosmic creation event. So, but yes, you can look at South America, the continental shelf off of South America, the continental shelf off of Western Africa, and you can see how they perfectly fit together. But we're looking at 250 million years for them to separate. It didn't happen in 5 months. The fastest plate tectonic movement that's ever been measured is that of India moving towards Asia. It's 22 centimeters per year. Now that they've collided with one another, India is only moving north at 5 centimeters per year. But that's the second fastest plate tectonic movement that's ever been measured in human history.
Last question. Lothar. You're still muted, Lothar.
Thank you. Appreciate all the time you've put into this. It's really a wonderful presentation and also the Q&As. I was thinking about climate change and did a lot of homework on it, and we're really going after the wrong thing. We're talking about CO2, which is really our friend as a fertilizer for the earth, because the earth is greened by a factor of the area of the U.S. from 1930 until the present day. Plants need less water because of the increase in CO2. We should be fighting pollution, but the CO2 is really our fertilizer.
Well, here's a couple of issues with CO2. You are right that increasing CO2 in the atmosphere can enhance photosynthesis, especially for C3 photosynthetic plants, but that only makes up 5% of the vegetation on the planet. All trees and our primary food grains are C4 photosynthesis, and they are optimized at a temperature, global mean temperature, 17 degrees centigrade. We're not there yet, but we're close to getting to 17 degrees centigrade. And so that would mean we'd have to shift our food sources to C3 photosynthesis, which can handle a higher temperature. But C3, you're looking at corn and sugar cane. Lots of calories, but very low in nutrients. So I would believe it's important that we retain C4 photosynthesis. The other thing about increasing carbon dioxide, it helps the vegetation. It does not help animals. You begin to see respiratory issues, and they're most significant for large active mammals. But guess what? We humans are in that category. We're large active mammals, and we live a long time.
But it's still in the ppm level. It's not really that.
Well, right now, it's not a problem. We expect it to begin showing up to be a problem at 450 parts per million. We're already at 425 parts per million. So we could get to 450 in a hurry. And if we ever get to 900, it would be utterly catastrophic.
It's not going to be increasing that level because you've got the greening of it's absorbing a lot of the CO2 as well. And also in the oceans.
It's true. The greening of the planet is absorbing more carbon dioxide, but not at a rate that keeps pace with the amount of carbon dioxide humans are putting in the atmosphere. So just based on health issues alone, I would argue we should not let carbon dioxide level get to 450. Our goal should be to keep it under 450. And hey, when it hits 450, it's not going to impact all humans, but people, for example, who have COPD, people have asthma, in fact, there's some studies indicating we're already seeing an increase in COPD and asthma, although a lot of that, I think, is attributed to coal. When you burn coal, you put black carbon soot in the atmosphere, you put aerosols in the atmosphere. So one thing I've written about in this paper I've submitted to Solar, we need to immediately replace coal with natural gas. With natural gas, you release only about half the greenhouse gases that you do with coal. The CO2 is cut in half.
Right. We need to really stop pollution, period.
Well, yeah, I mean, the best thing I think the US and Canada can do is supply China and India with all the natural gas they need on the condition they stop burning coal. I mean, for example, the life expectancy of people living in Delhi is now cut by 12 years as a result of their burning of coal. And so if we can give them the natural gas, their pollution would clear up, and you immediately cut the greenhouse. Carbon dioxide emissions are cut by 40%, 40 to 45% when you replace coal with natural gas.
Well, how about nuclear?
Okay, so Lothar, you're taking too much. I'm trying to cut this off,
All
so
right.
I'm sorry. I'm going to cut you off at this point and ask Hugh to close this meeting with a word of prayer.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Father in heaven, we just thank you for all the diverse people that have been able to participate in this event tonight. Thank you that we live in the 21st century where we have this amazing technology where we can engage one another. And Lord, too, thank you for just these incredible brains that you put in our bodies. Lord, I pray that you would enable us to use what you've given us with wisdom, with grace, with humility, that we can learn more and more about this amazing creation you've made and more about you. And Father, I pray too that we would allow your Holy Spirit to come into our lives and begin to transform us, giving us the desire and the power to live a Christian life, to live the life that Jesus of Nazareth demonstrated before us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. And thank you so much, Hugh. That was a great talk and great answers. Not everybody was satisfied, I know, but I think most of us were. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Hugh.